Daniel, you know, on Thursdays, we deal with issues, and it's nice to have a little time with just the two of us today.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that.
Daniel is the podcast producer around here, and a musician, and a man of great coffee expertise, which we should talk about sometime.
Yeah, we should. I'm
Hey,
sipping some Costco coffee right here because I'm
right.
desperate.
Wow. Did you pick up a vaccine while you were over there at the Costco? Did they have one of those for you?
Got a 6-pack, yeah.
Speaking of the vaccines, we're going to talk a little COVID, some relief, the future here on the podcast today. I'm in Minneapolis. I am standing up, and I'm going to make a big deal out of that because for the last 2 weeks, I've been saying that sometimes I stand up here in the home studio, sometimes I sit down, but I had been sitting down like constantly, and I've decided, no, it's important to stand up because sitting is the new smoking, and I want to kick the habit. So I'm going to stand up for the hour.
I've been sitting like 2 packs a day for a while, so I feel like I need to do something about that as well.
That's right. And let us know where you are. If you're watching on the live stream, we'd love to know where you're coming to us from and what you're doing. And if you're listening on the podcast, of course, we would very much love to hear from you on the podcast. And you can email us at podcast@votecommon.com. And if you're somebody who is watching on the live stream and you have not yet subscribed to our podcast, we would love it if you would. Head over to votecommongood.com/podcast. If you're not familiar already with where you would download a podcast and how you would do it, or if you don't have an app and you're one of those people and you like watching here on your computer screen, take us with you in that other way. But hey, Daniel, I was going to say, I know an awful lot of people, including one that I live with, who basically, they only use video stream as their podcast delivery. You know, like they watch a YouTube video or they'll watch this. They don't watch it. They don't look at it. It's on in the kitchen or the living room or the bedroom or somewhere. And it's just running the audio. So wherever you do your listening, we are super glad to have you. Hey, and it's been a year. Here's why I mark it as a year, Dan. Maybe you do too. It was 1 year ago today when the WHO taught the band to play, and they declared that the COVID-19 virus had reached a pandemic level. And that really marks the day that for, I think, a lot of the people in this country and around the world, they took that designation really quite seriously. I think with the exception of the then only once impeached president of the United States, Donald Trump, it didn't seem like they really wanted to give a whole lot of credence to the WHO. But the rest of us, and then ultimately within days, even the government of the United States came around to say, yeah, this is not going to just be a seasonal uptick in illness. This is really truly going to be something else. So March 11th is the day that feels to me like the day that we all recognize and notice what's been going on and what was going on, and was going to set the course for the next year.
Yeah, it seems like this week a year ago is when things started to fall apart.
A lot of people remember where they were. I happen to, because we were doing the Vote Common Good, Faith, Hope, and Love for a Change on Election Day 50-state tour. We were 38 states or 36 states in, and we were hearing about the virus. It was clearly building, and people were talking about it, everywhere that we went, just like people were talking about it, in their own private lives. But businesses were certainly starting to think about it. And we started to feel like this is getting a little more serious. I was going back through my photos and ran across a photo from March 11th, this day, 2020. And we did an event in Morgantown, West Virginia. And that was the last event that we did before we got back on the road with a totally recast, revisioned way to meet together that was COVID safe and socially distanced in August. So we went from March until August in that place of what are we going to do? And it was on, I guess it was maybe March 9th or 10th, and you're hearing these rumors. It was coming. I mean, it's hard to think back a year ago with all that has happened in our society. But there was a lot of confusion, right? There were a lot of people. You didn't know who to trust. And I'm someone, I think I've made it pretty obvious on this podcast that I thought that Donald Trump was not a trustworthy fellow. But I even thought there's no way it can be as bad as some of the darkest predictions we're making in late February and early March. There's no way it could actually be that bad and not have Donald Trump be saying something more significant about it, right? Like I was still fooled by the level of dishonesty and incompetence, and I thought, no, that like the federal government has mechanisms to tell us that this is a danger, and it was literally the day before the WHO made this announcement that Donald Trump went on television and said it's going to go away. It's a few cases. We've got a handle on it. We don't think it's going to be a problem. And we were all scrambling, for information. And it was clearly there was information that was competing with each other that was coming in. And I was really hoping, that it wasn't going to turn into something that would shut down our tour. That's all I kind of thought that it might be, is maybe people traveling, doing kinds of events that we were doing. And within, I don't know, felt like days, the reality was sinking in that, wow, this is going to shut down the entire global economy. Sort of
Yeah, I
incredible.
remember when big events started to shut down, like the NBA shut down and concerts were canceled and all these major things started happening. It's like, oh, I guess this is serious. And I kept, in the months after the shutdown, I kept thinking, like, this is such a softball for Donald Trump to be the hero.
Right.
Like, all he has to do is comfort the nation, tell us we're all in it together, listen to the experts. There was a pandemic playbook that was in place before he got there. They didn't follow that. He could have saved lives and he could have been the hero, but instead he chose to sow lies and play it off as nothing's wrong. It's just unreal.
Unreal. It is really unreal. And it created such confusion then that persists until this day, that a year later, there's still so many different versions of the level of concern, the level of danger. I was just in a conversation with a friend a couple of nights ago, and he was saying, every prediction that the WHO and the CDC, every prediction they've made is wrong. Like, they've just been wrong from top to bottom. Like, no, they haven't been. Like, we were having a discussion about how wrong they had been, right? This kind of thing just persists.
Yeah.
Regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, it's a different question. And COVID sort of ripped open all these ways of being confused about how we think about the information we have, the role of our government, and what kinds of restrictions or what kinds of latitude we should have as citizens. It really is, it's epic in that sense. Like, it touched every single area of life really rather quickly. So, hey, we've recounted a bit about where we were when we heard of this, and we'd love to hear from you. If you're in the chat, let us know not only where you are right now and what you're up to, but where were you when you first recognized that COVID was going to rearrange your life, when you first realized that the level that the deadly effect of this was going to be getting on everyone. Maybe you were on it early. Some people, they were really concerned in late January. Some people, I guess, in early January, and they really saw this coming. When did it really strike home for you in your own place? We'd love to hear those pieces of the story. And the thing that gets me about this is, you think in the last year we have literally lived through a global deadly pandemic, Like, that is the thing that kind of hovers above modern society the way we have it now, right? That movies are made out of this kind of thing. And we've done it as a globe. Now, it's not as bad of a pandemic as it could have been, right? If you imagine that, what if Ebola had spread to the degree that they thought that it was, with its effect that it has on the human body and its deadly rates. So there are worse versions that are still in the offing that still could strike humanity. But this is a pretty bad one. Like, this is one that has killed 500,000 plus people, 600,000, by the time we get through the end of this month, it looks like, or the end of next month. And that's with all the shutdowns just in this country. And that's with all the shutdowns that took place, right? Imagine if we hadn't put those shutdowns in place. Now, I know some people actually do imagine that, and they would very much like to imagine that that didn't happen, and they tell themselves that this wouldn't have been a problem had that not been the case. But we have survived a pandemic that would have killed 2 million people in this country alone if we hadn't gone to the great degree that we did. And just to think in a year, it feels like we're coming through it. And I know some people are saying they're being very loud about the fact that don't spike the ball on the 5-yard line. Don't celebrate too early. Many have slipped between the cup and the lip, but it does feel like we're in a different place, right? Vaccines are out. We've figured out, we'll talk a bit more about relief in a minute, but we figured out how for the federal government to respond to all of this and have really restructured our relationship of citizenry to the federal government, in some ways the state governments. It's been an extraordinarily transformative year. And in some ways, a transformative last 3 months, right? Much of the thing that feels different has come just since December when the pharmaceutical companies started to say with confidence that they could distribute these vaccines. So it's just shockingly, and it feels like every other issue that's happened in our world is something that we should be taking account of, thinking about about COVID and the pandemic and where we are. It is the most framing, important, globally shared experience that, of the last, I don't know, name it 50, 100 years, maybe since the last global pandemic.
Yeah. And I feel like this pandemic highlights and exacerbates all of the other societal issues we're facing. It pointed out the glaring disparities with race in our country. It points out the glaring disparities of poor nations versus rich nations in vaccine distribution. That's something we're going to have to wrestle with and figure out. I saw one thing where there's countries in Africa that it looks like they're not going to get vaccinated until, late next year, some even 2023. They're just not going to get enough vaccines for years. And because
that's so,
wealthy nations buy up the supply, and we haven't accounted for nations that can't afford to pay full price on these things. So
incredible. I guess as we think about the relief that has come, it's still really early, right? So I don't have a vaccine yet. Maybe you were you joking? You picked one up at Costco? Okay.
No.
The only reason I ask is because our Tuesday co-host Rob is going to be picking his up at Sam's Club on Saturday for reals. That's where he's getting his COVID vaccine. But this idea that 7 billion people, or I don't know, 70% of 7 billion people around the world are going to need to be vaccinated for there to be some blanket level of safety globally. Because pandemics, as we know, tend to move around the world. So if you leave a place being ravaged, first of all, it's immoral, it's harmful and deadly, but it also will infect and reinfect and allow a virus to mutate and to become something different. And, we've all learned a lot about viruses in these last 12 months. And I would imagine that in the next 12 months, we're going to be thinking about the global impact, as you say, in ways that we haven't even considered. And I'm not sure the United States is going to be the leader in that. I heard Joe Biden say yesterday that there's likely going to now be a surplus of vaccines in the United States by summer. Can you imagine that? That they have figured out how not only to create these vaccines that can work, but now to produce them on a scale that by July, there's projected to be more vaccines in the United States than people that still need to be vaccinated. That is a absolute modern day miracle that has taken out. It's a social miracle. And as you say, look, the Trump administration did one thing half right in their entire two things around COVID, two things half right. One, they supported the distribution of $2 trillion into the economy last March. Within 15, 16 days, 2 weeks of the shutdown, they were moving $2 trillion through the economy. Incredible that they didn't stand in the way of that, and we're fully behind it. And that they said that they would use the full power of the government to be sure to support whatever goes on with vaccines. They made that commitment, and that gave confidence to the vaccine creators. Now, I feel like we have to tell the full story on the truth of that. They didn't actually do the things that they were promised they would do to be sure the vaccines could be distributed. By the time we got to December, that whole project was in shambles and had to be built in the last 60, 70 days to get it to the place where the distribution would actually happen and to order enough vaccines. But they created the context in which the companies who chose to be partnering with the federal government could feel confident that was going to happen. That we pulled that off. And that all around the world, people start wearing masks. I was just looking around to see if I have my mask down here. This is like the one place in my life, in my little bunker basement, that I don't actually have a mask. I mean, they're all over my life. They're in my car. They're in my coat pockets. Yeah. They're in my in every room in my house. I have my go-tos, and then they're just sitting around. All over the world, you see photos and video of people wearing masks. That somehow a global population took on a practice that no one wants to take on and has engaged in it. That is going to be seen as a moment in, I think people are going to look back on this and describe the taking on of masks, the acquisition of mask wearing, as a proof that human beings can pivot in very short order to do things that benefit that are either they're demanded to do or that they believe benefit others without any positive reward for themselves, right? Mm-hmm. Like short of you're not going to get sick, but most people who wear masks feel like I'm doing this because it's the right thing to do, not just because I'm terrified that I'm going to get sick. Granted, some people are on the other side of that, but most of us.
I feel like that's one of the bright spots of this past year is seeing how people rose to the occasion and decided to do what's right to protect their neighbors. Mask wearing is one of those things. And we also saw, the frontline workers putting their lives on the line, especially in the early days of the pandemic when we didn't know how to treat this thing as well. We didn't know all the details of what it even was or exactly how it spread. Nurses and doctors just continued to do their jobs. And then we worked down the line of essential workers, and not too far below nurses and doctors are the grocery store clerks that kept us all fed and the Uber Eats drivers that delivered food to people that couldn't come out of their houses. And so it's a long list of really brave acts and loving acts by people in the world.
Such a great point. When you think about what an essential worker is, either by definition or sort of by just common acceptance, it's re-strataed our society in that sense, right? Like the categories that used to be like, well, medical professionals are at an economic and social level higher than someone who's a gig worker or is an hourly employee or works the jobs that make the system flow behind the scenes. But then when you hit a time like a pandemic, you start to say to yourself, well, what those people have in common is that they're essential to our society. Now, as we are calling this the COVID relief and the future, here's a big question for us. In the future, will we remember this idea, this reality, and structure all of our societal responses to people who do that work, and to continue to declare them to be essential to the functioning of our society? We've been told the reason some people get paid more is because they have a skill set or a willingness to do work that is beneficial to everybody. Right? It's more beneficial to the whole, so those people should be rewarded. This is one of the rationale for how our economies work the way that they do. It's either expertise or necessity. Well,
Hmm.
now we've concluded, oh boy, there's an awful lot of people that are necessary
Yeah.
in this who actually don't receive any of the other social accolades, benefits, support, care. In fact, very often their lives are pressured even more. They struggle
Hmm.
even more deeply. And I wonder if we're going to have some of our social influencing voices in our society start to advocate on their behalf. I wonder if the future if this will be a piece of the COVID world that we can carry forward
Boy,
as
I
we
hope
sort of.
so. Yeah, because if grocery store workers, as we now know, are essential to us staying alive, being fed, and getting the things we need to literally live, the argument for only paying them 7.25 an hour sort of falls apart. This isn't just a job for part-time high school kids. These are jobs that we need to have people doing as a society to continue to function, and we should be paying people at least a livable wage
Right,
to do
right.
that.
Yeah, and we should pay them well, and we should recognize them in our society, right?
Yeah.
For the role that they play. You think about these times when people would applaud, or people. There was a period, especially in April and May, when people were responding to those normally seen as background workers to our society. People were noticing them, calling them out, doing public recognition, thanking them. Well, I wonder if that isn't something that could be carried forward more, to recognize that that frankly, not only those jobs, but so many parts of our society
Yeah.
are taken care of, and they all become essential to this thing.
Mhm.
You certainly hope that school teachers and janitors and bus drivers and all the people that make a school system run, boy, because I'm feeling that in some ways there's this other push, right? There's this other push to say, oh, we've now sort of we had this year to look and decide what we really don't need, like what's not essential. So, lots of businesses are wondering this, like, do we have to have office space, and do I have to commute? Do we have to have in-person meetings? All of the rest of that to get along. There is a sorting going on, and I hope we also sort not just to like what can we get rid of, but what's really important, what really is essential to all of this,
Yeah.
and how do we think about it? And for those of us around something like Vote Common Good, where what we want to do is have people make the common good not only their voting criteria, but sort of their life ethic, right? That they would pursue the world with a sense that there is something of common good that can drive us, that can move us forward. That the other notions of what organizes humanity in our society really should first be under the glare of, is it about the common good? This is one of those times,
Mhm.
moments, periods of history that I hope we take a glance at. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, we're talking about it now, but I don't feel like I think about that as much as I would want to.
Yeah. Yeah, I feel like everyone, is anxious to get back to normal, um, but I think it's a real opportunity to make a new and better normal, because normal before this pandemic wasn't working for a lot of people either.
Yeah.
And so while it might be comforting to go back to, you know, being able to see people and things like that, I think that's what we talk about when we mean normal. There's a lot of the way it was that doesn't need to come back or needs to
Mm-hmm.
change. I
Mm-hmm.
think this is a
Mm-hmm.
real opportunity to dream up a better way forward.
All right, so COVID, relief in the future. So relief is coming. We mentioned vaccines already, that is coming that way. People are starting to feel much more comfortable and confident that they can do human things. Right? The I don't know, these poor people at the CDC. Like, look, the one place seemingly someone shouldn't want to work is in the messaging arm of the Centers for Disease Control, because the Centers for Disease Control, the pressure on them to have to take science and translate what they're learning from epidemiologists and from biologists and virologists, to have to translate that into recommendations for public action and behavior.
Mhm.
I mean, look, I'm all for the CDC. I just think we got to figure out other ways in our society to decide what voices are involved in helping us put together all of that deep science with all of the social lived reality to make predictions and suggestions about how we should move forward. Because these poor people are having to tell, lawyers, but governors, mayors, presidents, like what's acceptable and what you should do and not do. And while they're doing, they're making their recommendations, I don't know how you feel about them, Dan, but they're confusing to me. Like they don't feel like they follow a logic sequence that the shutdown felt like it followed, right? We would all say we have to bend the curve. We can't overwhelm the health system. It felt like we've ebbed and flowed in why we had to do a in the general understanding and the public statements about why we were doing these shutdowns. It was to not overwhelm the health system with so many sick people, not only because the more people that get sick, the more people die, but the big worry was that the entire health system would collapse, and that would then compound not only those deaths, but all the other places where our medical system couldn't function, right? So if you'd imagine that we had doubled or even a higher rate than what we had, would have been a real problem. So all that bend the curve stuff, remember that from April and May, and we had to bend the curve. That was on infection rates as they led to hospitalizations, which led to intensive care, which led to death, and you had to stop those numbers because our health system was not prepared to treat the numbers of people that were being infected, which tells us there's a real problem with the supply side of our health system. And the CDC's having the Centers for Disease Control having to make recommendations. It was clear before, bend the arc, bend the curve, keep hospitalizations down so that the system doesn't overflow. Because people are like, well, what happens if all the doctors get sick? What if the fire department gets sick? What if the other emergency work? What if across our society we start to see a collapse because the people who work in power plants and the people that work in sanitation, what if sickness gets all over? Then we're going to have a serious problem, right? When the structures of society start to collapse because we can't care for people through our healthcare system. That was the pandemic nightmare that the shutdown was trying to prevent, right? The ultimate problem wasn't simply how many people are going to get sick and die. That is a problem. But the impact of that, it wasn't just the number, it was what that would mean is the cascading effect from that moral tragedy of that number of deaths would be compounded so severely. That's what we have to think about and remember. And if our health system is this vulnerable, and this pandemic was manageable as it was, and was only as dangerous and as communicative. What's it called when something spreads from person to person?
That might be it.
As spreadable as it is, we're in real problem. We have a real problem here. And this is something that with all the relief that has come, I'm not sure we're properly addressing in this society, and people better start thinking about what we do on our healthcare delivery side.
Yeah. Yeah, and that reminds me of the early days when ventilators were in such short supply. And I just remember being astounded that we didn't have enough, and we didn't have enough trained personnel to use them. But then the Trump administration decides to have states bidding against each other to get the limited supply of ventilators. It was like the most capitalistic supply and demand way of doing things, and it just felt incredibly morally problematic to put states against each other for these life-saving devices. It was just really fascinating to watch.
Yeah, there's that old saying that when you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. That kind of notion that if you have your mindset locked into something, you'll just provide the same solution over and over. There was a version of government that was pervasive with the Trumpites that was stay out of have the federal government stay out and create competition so that businesses can solve problems. That version of republicanism, that's all they saw. So even in the midst of a crisis like this, even after giving $2 trillion into the economy, the federal government said the best thing we can do, stay out of it, leave it up to the states, help the states, but don't give guidance or direction or demand. Certainly don't invoke the Defense Production Act, which would tell companies what they can and can't make, taking over factories. Just encourage them to do it. And the best way to do that is with competition. It's like, no, that is the worst. The worst way to respond to a crisis is with competition, right? Competition is a very important part of every economic system. It's not best to be deployed when you're in the midst of a deadly pandemic that you don't understand and you're experiencing shortages. But the people who are making the decisions inside the Trump administration and in governorships around the country were so committed, until this day, have remained committed to that practice, that they have a giant competition and deregulation hammer, and they're going to run around and smack everything with it, hoping that, a certain percentage of those are nails. And it's really the government. I mean, in my deep critique of republicanism, that thing that sits at the heart of the imagination of a Republican vision in the country it has been proven to not work over and over and over again. In fact, the relief that came in the first CARES Act, the relief that came in this most recent one, has now moved in a year, or committed to move $4 trillion into direct payment and reimbursement into individuals and states and counties. $4 trillion. Do you know how you solve a global pandemic and economic shutdown? You give people money. You don't have people compete and make a scarcity resource and then have people compete for it. You flood the zone. The way you solve this is to give and give and give until it's overflowing, and then you do the cleanup of what we do with an excess of money in our economy. That's how you do it. You don't take this approach. And look, and that's not always the right approach, right? There are times when flooding the zone with money is not the best thing to do. But a crisis, the way you get people out of poverty is not complicated. I don't know if that sounds too cavalier. You know what the best way is to get somebody out of poverty? Give them money. Look, pick up a group of people influenced by poverty in this country, anywhere in the world. If you give them enough money to spend, they will no longer be in poverty. That's the way you do it. Now, everyone agrees on that. Some people would just say they should get the money when they do certain things, work for it, earn it, gamble right in the stock market, then you get it. But everybody knows the way you get people out of poverty is you give them money. What's the mechanism by which we give them money? There's the great debate. But there are people who don't acknowledge that it's the distribution of money to people who don't have it that allows them to not be poor.
And I feel like there's a lot of good Christian people who are still so pull yourself up by the bootstraps, and rather than give a man a fish, teach a man to fish. But you can do both, right? You can teach someone to fish while giving them food so they don't have to go hungry while they're working. It's like, I don't understand this commitment to not being generous and helping people financially.
Yeah, it just doesn't make any sense, right? Like, if we deal with poverty, which we do all around the world, and poverty rates around the world in the last 50 years have declined dramatically. All over the world, people are less poor everywhere, and there are less people who are poor everywhere. The reason that's happened is people who used to be poor have money. That's it. It's not even that they have jobs. A job, as it relates to poverty, is simply a means by which people gain money, right? A job is important for a whole lot of reasons. I know very wealthy people who still work. Like the importance of work and jobs and contribution and social life and all of that, incredibly important. In fact, wealthy people keep working all the time. And people who no longer need to work will do it for all sorts of reasons. Even giving all their money away, they'll keep working, right? Mm-hmm. Because work is separate from the basic requirement that people need to have the money to live on. Now, you could argue that, boy, you know what would really be bad is people who get money and they feel like they don't deserve it and they didn't work for it. We should experiment with that for, say, 50 years in our world. Let's see what happens. Like, how bad does the world actually get if there's enough money for everyone so that no one lives in poverty, and see what that does to motivation, see what it does to civil society. See, like, we've been experimenting with this other version since forever. Why don't we give this one a try? And this
just try it out.
Just try it. Let's try it for 50 years and see how it goes. Because if you think people having money and not having to work for it is a bad thing, then let's start with trust fund kids. Let's start with families that have put enough money in an inheritance that a kid doesn't have to work a summer job to pay to go to college. Let's be sure that everybody who has enough money and can be a stay-at-home living person has to go get a job, because we're so worried that if people don't work for it, if somehow there's not some string attached, that you know what they're going to do? They're just going to turn into horrible people. Well, I don't know. Maybe that's true, because I do know some trust fund kids, and I know one family in particular that hasn't had to work for it, and they kind of are horrible people. But no one says this, right? No one says, hey, let's be sure that you earn enough money, that if you earn enough money where you don't have to work anymore, that somebody steps in and makes sure you work pretty hard. Like, there are people who, like, what they want to do is develop a business when they're 22, and when they're 26, they want to sell the business and have enough money to live on. Well, according to this other theory, what you'd be saying is, hey, that would be the worst thing in the world for you. That you had some moment where you acquired all the money you need to live on. Now what are you? Just some trust fund welfare queen? I mean, your life would be devastated. No one says that about the entrepreneur that hits it big when they're 22 and sells out when they're 26. People say that's the American success story. But if you say to a 22-year-old, we're going to make sure you have enough money to live on where you never fall into poverty, and that a child never has to go hungry, and that there's enough of basic needs that are going to be met, people say, well, what would that do to the person? That's going to ruin their life. I'm just on a rant here. If it's true that it's going to ruin someone's life for them to have money that pays for their lives that they're no longer working for, then they
don't have to worry about where their next meal is coming from. They don't have to worry about medical bills. They don't have to worry, what would they do with all that extra time? And
just going to sit around, apparently. I mean, this is where there's classism, racism, culturalism that plays in and says, well, no, like if I strike it rich when I'm 22 and I can retire when I'm 26, I'm the kind of person that's going to continue to contribute to society. But other people, well, they're just going to sit around and play video games. I don't know, or make art, or start new businesses, or do something creative, or be helpful. Like, they'll do the things that human beings do. The one thing we know is when you give people money, they're able to then live the kind of life that's not base sustenance life. So this is what the CARES Act and this is what the American Rescue Act is doing. It is moving all of this money. Like, as it turns out, this new bill that passed yesterday and is going to be signed into law tomorrow, it's going to have the greatest effect on poverty in the United States history. Once this money moves through the system.
20% of people out of poverty, something crazy like that. It's just incredible.
The lowest 20% of people in the United States will see a 20% increase in their income. Many of those people, that will be enough for them to no longer be living with the fears that they have. And it comes across the board. Some are cash payments, some are increases to people that have to raise that are raising children. Some of it comes in extra food subsidies. Some of it comes in child care support. Like, it's going to come into people's lives through multiple streams. The $1,400 checks or automatic deposits that are going to be issued fairly soon, that's the most consistent. But the lowest income people, it's going to come from multiple angles. This is why conservatives and Republicans did not vote for this bill, because they know that it challenges the very notions that they've been living by, which was scarcity and competition is the only way to survive. So circling all the way back to 10 minutes ago about how the Trump administration and Republicans responded to ventilators is the same way that we've been responding to poverty the whole time. Create scarcity, create competition, and let people use the free market to drive themselves out of it.
And the
Hasn't
dirty
worked.
secret is when you give people money, they put it back into the economy, which creates more jobs and boosts spending and does all the things that they claim trickle down will do, but never does.
Turns out that's how the economy works, right? You give money to people who spend it, and then they spend it, and then other people buy it, and it keeps the wheel spinning. Yeah, this is the thing, that all kinds of spending are different. So this is okay. Let's do a little more economics here on this relief bit. There have been 3 times in the last 4 years where $2 trillion has been moved from the federal government into the economy. The first, the tax cut of 2017. Paul Ryan, Donald Trump, and crowd said, we want to create a tax policy that will move $2 trillion that was coming into the federal government and put it back into people's bank accounts. And we're going to target that at the wealthiest individuals and corporations in the country to impact our economy. So we literally will get to compare that version with $2 trillion in July and $2 trillion of July of 2020 and $2 trillion in March of 2021. And this will be the first time in a very similar economic set of conditions that we will be able to compare and contrast the economic theories. And basically what this is going to lead to, I think could lead to in this whole relief, is the consideration that there's 3 things that need to happen. We need to have more federal supply on the healthcare side. We need to give direct cash payments to the poorest and low-income people in this country. And we need to provide basic services as a utility, not as an expense, specifically the internet and electricity and water. We need to move the internet into the category of electricity and water and make sure that it's available to people without regard to a money-making scheme by a private company. Because we've realized, man, if you didn't have the internet, and the fact that the internet has not become a bone of contention yet, I mean, other than that, people arguing about, cancel culture and all the rest. But the fact that we haven't said, without the internet, none of this shutdown could have happened. We need to make sure that the internet is accessible to everybody in this society as a basic public utility, that they can be charged for as a base public utility, not as a profit center for private companies. We have to make public the distribution of connection to the internet. If I were to ever run for office, these would be the 3 things, because they were proven in the midst of a crisis. We need more takeover or more supply coming from our federal government when it comes to our healthcare, something more like a large and well-functioning VA, where the federal government delivers the actual healthcare, so that this never happens again, that the system has to shut down because we didn't have enough supply of healthcare. The free market failed in that sense, right? And then we need to give cash dollars to people. It's the thing that works. It is proven over. And obviously we know this because we do it with unemployment. We do it with Social Security payments. We do it with pension retirements. We do it with money for the lowest income, but not enough for people to live on. We already know that moving money to people who need it is the best way to deal with financial issues. That's why we make sure banks don't collapse, because we always say, like, well, they control the flow of money. And if you don't have a flow of money, how would you ever get along? So we know. These are things we know. And all of the relief that's going to come through this relief business of this time, it seems to me, needs to become normative for us. If anything in the future is going to look anything better than the past.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think with healthcare, it's pointed out that as a society, we've put this high value on doctors and the amount of money it takes to go to school and become a doctor, the time investment. But we're also seeing that the folks that do arguably as much or more of the hands-on work, nurses and PAs and all the other staff, the pay disparity is so great. And the burnout is so high for these, ER nurses and critical care nurses, because they're stretched too thin. There's not enough people doing the work. They work long hours, crazy schedules. And as a society, we haven't valued them enough. The free market hasn't decided that they should be paid enough to draw more people into the field. And so we're left with this shortage of nurses and folks that keep the wheels going.
And you sort of ask yourself, can we take this moment and move us forward on that one? I don't know. I don't know if the future, when there's a future pandemic, whether it's 100 years from now or sometime far, more recent than that, are we going to say, hey, we really do have a pandemic playbook. We know how to do it. This isn't speculation. Mm-hmm. We've run it for a year. We know what we can do. And if we know what we need to do, and those are all things to respond to a crisis like this, and look, it could be a pandemic. It could also be a terrorist attack that moves through our society. There's a number of things that could cause a kind of pandemonium in our society that the pandemic has. And if we would respond in those ways to those conditions, why don't we make those ways more normative? Why is that so exceptional? Why is it that 0 Republicans in the Senate, 50 of them, and in the House said, I voted for by the way, all of them that were around, voted for the tax deal that was $2 trillion. And we voted for the one in May that was $2 trillion. We voted for the $800 billion one in December, but we're not going to vote for this one in March because we think it's a little off. Oh, really? Is that what it is? You're truly nitpicking? Like I watched the comments from the senator from Mississippi who didn't vote for the bill and then is out championing the fact of many of the benefits that come to restaurants and small business people. And he said, well, I like that part. I didn't vote for the bill because I didn't like the other parts.
Well, you don't get to take credit for the thing you voted against.
Yeah, first of all, I get it. That's a bummer. You didn't get all that you want, but you could have voted for it because you said, I'm really supportive of this. But because had there not been enough senators who would have voted for it, you wouldn't have been able to say, well, there's the part that I liked. So this idea that they're just not going to be supportive of it because it's not the philosophy that they hold to. And I grant this to Republicans. They're back to being philosophical. God love them. I mean, they were not philosophical for 4 years. They were not worried about the deficits. They were not worried about how spending went in 2017 tax deal. They didn't care about their economic theories for 4 years, and now they've returned to their roots, and they care about their old school philosophy. The only thing they held on to was competition and scarcity and deregulation. And what did that get us? Has been proven out time and time and time again. So this is where we find ourselves, right? Is that we're at a year, and in a lot of ways, March 10th, 11th, and 12th are not of 2021 are like the mirror image of March 10, 11, and 12 of 2020, when the NBA shut down and I think some hospitals started to say we're running out of room. And then the WHO said, we think we're now going to declare this a global pandemic. And then states started to put mandates into place. Now, this year, we're on the other side, right? The economy's not shutting down. The economy just got a huge boost of $2 trillion to solve for the major issues of the COVID pandemic for the first time and all the spending in the last year. And things are starting to open back up again, and people are getting vaccines, and hospital rates are declining. So we're on the other side of all of that in a year. Incredible. I mean, it's been a really long year, and I wish it had taken 6 months. But it seems like this is about as good as, one should reasonably hope for. Now, moving forward, are we going to learn these lessons? Are we going to say that what you have to do in relief is what you should do in your normal life? It's like going to a doctor who helps you with some kind of major lifestyle, helps you with a medical issue that's caused by lifestyle behavior. And then after they do this, so you have a heart surgery, or you deal with some organ struggle, and they say the way you've been living created the context for your body to respond like this. So we can fix it, but the best thing for you to do is to change the way that you live moving forward. I don't know if you know this, Dan, but there's been big studies on this, like especially around smoking and eating. And the statistics on these long-term studies are basically no one changes bad behaviors. Doesn't happen. Like, they were trying to figure out, I can't remember this, the details of the study, but it was a medical industry sort of study. Like, we're going to figure out what are the conditions in place that cause someone to actually make changes. And what they learned was people don't make changes.
No.
They don't do it. Like people that, have, they go to their pulmonologist for a lung problem due to smoking, keep smoking. People that overeat, they keep using food in ways that damage their body. People that don't exercise and sit down in their podcasts just keep staying seated in their podcasts. Like, we don't make those changes. So how daunting this is, if you take this as a big metaphor, this is what we're facing. That on this anniversary of the recognition of how bad the virus is publicly, are we going to make a commitment as a society and as individuals to call for people who make societal determinations, whether it's how we treat people, as we've been talking about, or our economic theories, or just generally the way we think that the world ought to go? This is really what we're facing.
Yeah, I think it's, again, a way to imagine a better way forward, and hope that enough of us get on board to make it possible. Because I think if the pandemic has proven anything, it's that some people, like you said, won't change their behavior. And no matter the science, no matter the evidence, no matter the sight in front of your face, they will refuse for any number of reasons to do what's best for them and others. I've seen some memes and videos about how sci-fi, in all the sci-fi pandemic movies that have ever come out, vastly underestimated how dumb we would be in responding to something like this. The case in point is the mask burning ceremony out in, was it Idaho the other day?
I think it was Idaho.
People so upset about wearing a piece of cloth or fabric on their face that they had to burn them. I mean, it's just astounding.
Astounding. And this is the part that's confusing, right? On the one hand, like we mentioned earlier, people all over the globe have taken it on. They did it. And then there's this hard pushback. I heard a commentator say something I thought was so insightful. He said, look, this is after Abbott in Texas and the governor in Mississippi said, okay, shutdown's over, COVID's done, The whole state is open. Mask mandates are lifted. Good luck, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
This commentator said, look, I understand that there could be an argument made for opening the economy because there's economic reasons and there's real debates about the best way to move this forward. And there's real data that tells us that companies are struggling and aren't going to make it, and we do have to get them open. That's a debate.
Mm-hmm.
Not wearing a mask, that isn't a thing that actually presents any harm.
Right.
There's not another side to the argument short of, I don't want to, you can't tell me to.
Right.
It's an inconvenience. It's not like, and people try to say that there are. I've promised you, I've overheard and been in direct conversation with people who tell me that if you have the COVID virus in, then it can't get out when you exhale, and then you suck it in again and you get it twice as bad. No, that's not how
Never heard that
works. That's true about my bad breath, that I realized, oh my gosh, my mask doesn't stink. My breath does. That's true. It doesn't get out, comes back into my nose, and probably makes me sick of smelling my
I'm
own
brushing
breath.
my teeth a lot more these days, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, I had to chew a lot of the peppermint gum. But there's not a argument to say, hey, we got to release the mask mandates because this is the effect that it has on the common good.
Mm-hmm.
It's an irritant. Look, I get it. I would
minor
gladly be a
irritant.
guy that doesn't wear a shirt all the time. I would prefer restaurants where I don't have to wear shoes. But I get that for the most part, we've agreed that it's generally unsightly to not have a shirt on in a restaurant. I mean, you let it happen at a beach, but generally when you're at the Chipotle and you're standing in line there, there's a social norm about like your body hair not being out in the business, and it's weird where we draw that line. Like, is it your shoulder or is it, but no shirts, no shoes, get you no service. I think shoes are probably to try to keep the hippies out, but maybe we can make an argument that it carries some kind of disease, but I'm not sure why that would be worse. I don't see anybody burning shirts, chucking their shoes into the ocean, and walking into restaurants without a shirt and without shoes on. And to watch people walk in without a mask on because they don't want to wear it, to walk over to the table where you get to take it off, even in a mask mandate state, there is no argument for this. Not to say that government interference in people's lives isn't a decent rationale, but it just simply is not like, should we open the economy and should we start businesses up again? And to conflate these two things in people's minds, mm-hmm. that wearing a mask is somehow to give in to something else, that's just really... it's an argument worth having separate from, maybe once the mask mandates aren't a health concern any longer, we could, as they like to say in the business world, we could circle back on this one and drill down on it and try to figure out.
And worst case scenario, what if we get to the end of this and they do some studies and figure out that masks weren't as effective as we'd hoped and they only prevented 30% of transmissions. Worst case scenario, we all wore masks a little more than we had to. Like I just don't get the outcry. Like, what if it saves a few lives? I'm gonna do the easy, painless thing and just wear a mask.
Yes, I mean, just the base level of like not sneezing in a public space without somehow interfering with the sneeze, to not cough without either covering it with a cloth, your hand or your elbow. That's just normal respect for stuff gets spread when it comes flying out of your body. Let's keep it back for a bit. And when we know that there is something that is aerosol transmitted that has this power to cause this kind of disruption, really? I don't know. Maybe every anti-masker, we should do a whole conversation with somebody who's reasonable and opposed to masks to see, like, maybe they would be yelling at their computer screen if they had to listen to this by saying, no, that's not what we're saying. I almost have to believe they're saying something more than what I think they're saying. But I have tried to listen, and all I've gotten to is, you can't tell me, I don't want to, it makes things worse. Those are the three arguments I've heard over and over.
Not to go down a longer rabbit trail, but I think the CDC did itself a disservice when initially said, no one needs to wear masks except for the people in the hospitals. And then, of course, reversed that and said, yeah, everyone mask up. I think the confusion around that eroded a little bit of trust early on, which has caused some problems. But it's like, no one knew what was going on with this pandemic. And when we learned more information, we adapt our strategy and say, oh, yep, it helps if everyone wears a mask. Let's do that now.
I remember when I was first hearing a person suggesting that everyone wear a mask, that there was a particular person who was advocating this in March and April. And it was like, what? I mean, I remember just thinking, like, that's bananas. People aren't going to do it. It felt odd. It's like, where would I even get a mask? I mean, the N95s and 3M and like, it was just like pandemonium and chaos, right? And then the person who works for the government came out and showed you how to make one at home with a bandana. And it just felt, right, like you're saying, like, wow, it was chaos. But then as you thought about it more and they talked about it more and you realize, okay, here's what we're going to do and here's how it's going to
work. Out of your mouth onto others. I can see where.
And you're right. The CDC did say we have a shortage of these masks. Please don't wear them for your own use. Let them be only for medical workers. And right now, we don't think that this is transmitted in that way outside of certain health system environments where there's very, very sick people. That's why you don't need to wear one at home. You do now. And then they recognized, no, that data is not correct. It's only transmitted like this. And we do think that it'll have this kind of an effect. And so now we're going to make this recommendation. So for the people who say, well, if the CDC hadn't said not to do it, then I would have been fine with it. Really? Like, you're the person who you're so committed to the CDC's recommendations that you're going to stick with the early ones. You're like the fan of the band that was really into their first two albums, but then when they hit it big, you can't stand to listen to them anymore. Like that argument that people would say, well, the CDC said, and then they said this. So why does we didn't have the right information and we made calculations based on a whole lot of data that we've now corrected mean you don't listen to them? There is zero rationale for saying that a agency that's dedicated to getting out the best information as they have it would have the best information the entire time. So it seems to me that maybe there's something else going on with the masks. And again, the fact that our best delivery system is the Centers for Disease Control as being the spokesperson to respond. And that was put on the Trump administration. They decided that they were going to bat this over to the CDC and let them have to figure it out like a big game of pickleball. They were just going to keep knocking that thing back over the net and make sure
but then silencing them when they didn't like what the CDC had to say.
And then being like, well, they don't know. Nobody knows. I mean, how could you know?
Who can know? Who can know anything?
Unknowable. Well, hey, we take our Thursdays to talk about current topics and issues. On this day, it was cathartic, at least, to feel like it's been a year. We're on the other side. Boy, do we know a lot. And as we like to say around here, we want to have an open-eyed, positive view toward what's happening in the world, and then say, what should we do in light of it? So we're glad to have you along with us. Thanks for everybody who listens. If you're a podcaster, keep us in your ears. If you're somebody who watches online, keep us in your ears and eyes, because it's good to see you, good to be seen by you, and of course, good to be heard by you. Daniel, anything left for you?
Well, this is sort of part one of our conversation about COVID, because tomorrow on Science Friday, our guest is Yanir Bar-Yam, and he's an American scientist and activist specializing in complex systems. He's an expert in the quantitative analysis of pandemics. So we're going to go deep into behavioral science of why a bunch of people decide they don't want to wear masks and the best way forward from this pandemic. So it's going to be a great conversation tomorrow, kind of part two of this conversation.
Now, someone with this level of understanding isn't going to interfere with a well thought out rant, is he, tomorrow?
There's always room for a rant.
We'll see. We'll see. We hope so. All right. I hope so. A little news and a little opinion. That's what you get around the Vote Common Good podcast. So glad to have you all. Thanks. It's Thursday. See you tomorrow morning when it's Friday.